we now move very rapidly, and I'm going to have to apologize to Jonathan, but those were very important words from both of our governmental officials. Jonathan, I'm going to be turning this over to you, to our first panel, which is the robust democratic politics, assessing Ukraine's progress and regress.
Walter, thank you again for the opportunity to participate. I also want to thank your co-sponsors for hosting today's event. And so this scorecard has become particularly important, as you said, quite early on to measure reform progress, but also Euro-Atlantic progress of Ukraine. This is a timely conversation. I think this year in particular, given the circumstances in Ukraine, also in Ukraine's region, we're seeing very significant changes in countries like Belarus today. We're seeing what's taking place in Russia as well, including Putin's numbers collapsing, failed response to COVID-19, continued meddling. But we're also seeing Europe, the US, and others globally really struggling right now, both internally, politically, economically as well. So Ukraine is in this mix, but it's a real global challenge, as Ivana pointed out a few seconds ago, that we are all sort of in this deep and challenging moment. So we're going to obviously talk about reforms, but I wanted to just thank both the ambassador and Ivana too for both pointing out, from my perspective, why Ukraine continues to remain a key priority and a key partner for the United States, for the EU, for the UK, for others, for Canada, and for explaining why it's in our interests to continue to engage on these issues, to have events like we're having today, and why so many people are putting in an effort to support Ukraine's democratic progress, its economic progress. And our panelists today are three of those that have always and have been working on the topic of both Ukraine, but support for Ukraine, both from Washington and then also on the European side too in London. And so Orysia, Steve, and Orest, thank you so much for being here. Orysia is with Chatham House, Orest, with the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. He's also the co-chair of the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine. Stephen Nix needs no introduction in terms of his role with IRI in Ukraine. I'm going to let everybody look at full bios because I know we have such a short time frame to get to the topics at hand. But first of all, just thank you to our speakers for joining today. And I think you heard both what the ambassador said and Ivana said about Ukraine's progress, where it stands today, its Euro-Atlantic track and commitment, and of course, this isn't the first time that some of you have been here. Last year, I just want to recall that the grade for this particular panel on reform progress, and I'll talk, there's multiple reform areas. We won't get to all of them today, and some of it will come up in some of the other panels. It was a B, which is really a very positive movement forward. If you recall last June, I think many of us who are looking at Ukraine were looking at this transition, a new government, President Zelensky, tremendous amount of hope amongst the Ukrainian population and with Ukraine's partners that there would be considerable movement forward on reforms from anti-corruption to focus on, it was mentioned, custom and tax, decentralization, electoral reform, because that's also on the plate, which I know there's a couple of experts here who can speak to these issues. But there was a tremendous amount of hope. And a new RADA came in, really starting in September. So we're really looking now at a year that really starts in June of 2019. It goes to June 2020, right where we are today. And a RADA that's been in place for at least, for 10 months and has been carrying out reforms, starting off very quickly with what was called turbo reform efforts, where a number of key reforms were passed fairly quickly. And I think there was a lot of hope in that space and time. So I just want to just point out a couple of things, and then I'm going to turn to our speakers. One is that that policymaking and reform progress in Ukraine still faces some of the same old challenges and some new challenges. One challenge I didn't really hear a deep enough conversation on in the first panel, but we'll go to that. What was mentioned earlier about old challenges was the continued war of aggression by Russia in the east in Crimea. And also, Ivana mentioned the retrenchment of oligarchic forces, some deeply troubling collusion with pro-Russian forces in Ukraine, attempting to thwart reform progress and Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. I think this has become exacerbated in the last several weeks, and we can go into that as well. Democratic reforms that have been adopted by the Rada, but not fully implemented. This has been a challenge since the Maidan, where you have reforms passed in the Rada and government support, but they're not implemented. So that's a challenge. We're seeing continued attacks on anti-corruption bodies. This is something that has caught the attention of Ukraine's Western partners, Ukrainian civil society, real concerns about whether or not anti-corruption bodies within Ukraine can act independently and are able to do their job. We see an uptick in politically motivated investigations. This is not new in Ukraine as well. And as was mentioned, what's taking place with President Poroshenko, but it's not only that, it's former Zelensky officials who are leaving that are being placed under suspicion or investigation, and that's problematic. We still see attacks on civil society, some that have not been responded to. Lack of transparency in health procurements is one new challenge related to COVID-19, which we'll talk about. And so those are just some of these old challenges that continue to exist that give a lot of heartburn to those that are grading Ukraine on reforms. When we want to see progress, and we've seen some progress, these old vestiges of challenges remain. Some of the newer challenges that we're seeing in this period include, and it's hard to believe this is new, which is really Ukraine being drawn into U.S. politics. And Orysia, I know you've mentioned this. I saw a quote from you in the Washington Post the other day on this challenge of Ukraine being drawn in unwittingly or wittingly, depending on who is responsible for what part of this aspect. And this has really had a negative impact on both Ukraine and the impact on the relationship. There's still strong bipartisan support, if we're talking about Washington, for Ukraine, and I think that won't change. But we're in the middle of a U.S. presidential election, and Ukraine being drawn into this is not helpful to Ukraine reform efforts. It actually draws attention away from what needs to be done domestically in Ukraine. Global trends, Ivana mentioned those as well. What we're seeing in terms of rising authoritarianism, challenges to democracy, and I don't view, just personally, I don't view the West as having the sole ownership over issues such as democracy or market-oriented economies. I think, Ivana, if I could just switch it and say that it's so important, this is a global, we all own democracy. It doesn't matter if it's in Asia or in Europe or the United States. And I think we need to, for those forces that support democracy, human rights, transparency, and rule of law, this applies everywhere. But we are seeing those global trends. And because of COVID-19, which I'll talk a little bit about, it's really been challenged, and this has become a bigger issue. So last, I want to just talk about two things. One, the distraction of the US and the EU, which we're seeing, and then COVID-19, which I'll end with. Particularly COVID-19, I think there's no greater socioeconomic and political challenging facing Ukraine right now. And I think by not putting that front and center, we're kind of missing the moment. And it's important because it greatly impacts reform progress. It can be used as a reason not to move forward on reforms, or new laws can be put in place based on the response that may have an impact on reforms on human rights. And that needs to be something that we need to carefully watch, both in terms of how you're scoring today, but also going forward. And my understanding today, there was a record-breaking 758 new cases of COVID-19 and reported 31 deaths. So this is a difficult situation that Ukraine is going to be facing, including whether we talk about second waves or response, the economic impact. But there's also an issue of transparency, of democracy. And what we have seen globally is governments taking advantage of the moment to either move backwards in terms of their reform efforts. And then we're also seeing corruption rise. during this period. And with the United States, the EU, and others distracted by their own domestic challenges, it is so important that we not lose sight of engaging Ukraine on these issues now, so that you don't come out of the other end of COVID-19 in Ukraine, hopefully when we do have a vaccine, in a worse shape than it was before going in. And so I just wanted to raise that. We see new waves of disinformations. We see efforts to resolve the crisis conflict in the east of Ukraine being put on hold because of COVID-19. So you can see that there's all these challenges. Ukraine, I'll just end with this, and then I'm going to turn to Steve to kick us off. Necessity is the mother of invention. And if you look at Ukraine reforms back in February, there was deep concerns that the government would not move forward on some of the key reforms that the IMF and others were asking them to move forward on. COVID-19 hits, Ukraine's economy suffers greatly and was in need of macroeconomic support. The IMF rightfully came forward, which is important, but one has to wonder, sort of in this reform process, if the reforms were being driven solely by the need, the necessity of the moment, versus what the government really was committed to. And so as we see government reshuffles in Ukraine that are disconcerting, officials being replaced by those who may not be as qualified, and as we see government in Ukraine making decisions not based on a plan to move Ukraine closer to the Euro-Atlantic community in a fashion that is proactive, you have to have concern. So I'll give my grade at the end of this. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Nix for his opening thoughts. And I know that he was going to touch on political parties. There's an upcoming election this fall, local elections that are critically important for Ukraine. But also, Steve always has his finger on the pulse, and so does his great staff, both in Kiev and Washington, how the Ukrainian public is viewing both the reform efforts, support for Euro-Atlantic track, but also maybe, and it's hard to get a full assessment right now, but how COVID-19 and how the coronavirus pandemic is actually reshaping public opinion on key issues. Steve, it's a lot to throw to you, and we'll try to get it in. And please, if everybody, all of our speakers can try to condense their responses, because I think we have a shorter time frame on both ends to get to our conversation and maybe some questions. So Steve, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, and дякую, Vladko, za zaproszenie wystąpić сьогодні. So today I'm going to focus on political parties in Ukraine, and I'll start by giving an overview of the major parties in the context of the upcoming local elections to be conducted on October 25th. So first off, we'll discuss Sluha Naroda. Again, we all know the facts, 2 sweeping victories in both the presidential and parliamentary elections, and doing so without what we would call a traditional political party, at least a political party as we would define it. The campaigns were run basically virtually with some television. There wasn't a traditional ground game, and the party didn't really establish political muscle, organizational muscle in all of the regions of the country. So a very, very different type of campaign. So it was a reasonable question to ask, if the president was not going to run for re-election, what's the future of his party? Why would he be interested in building a truly national traditional party? And I think we got an answer to that question recently when the president asserted that he was now rethinking his statement and now felt that in order to achieve what he wanted to achieve, that he needed a second term. So that suggests to us that Sluha Naroda will develop, that the president and his team will devote time and resources in the coming years to truly build what we would consider a national party with a ground game that can turn out votes. So that shifts now then to European Solidarność. The party suffered some major defeats, but is rebounding. We're working very closely with them, as with other political parties. They are recruiting candidates for the local elections, restructuring to party building than they had.
Steve, just a two-finger, not just to cut in for 1 second. You're freezing and I'm freezing, so maybe you can go back because I think we just missed that last point, and maybe we just check his connection on the video side.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. I was discussing European Solidarność, and what we're seeing is that the party is devoting far more time and resources to party building than they did when they were in power. So an increased focus on party building with an eye towards the local elections, where we think that they'll be competitive in certain regions in Ukraine. Next, we go on to Golos, which is a huge question mark now with the recent resignation of the party leader, the faction leader in parliament, Vakarchuk. So we don't see a lot of planning by the party in terms of competing for local elections. The most recent development is with the mayor's party. You probably saw the announcement today. Mayor Filatov of Dnipro has announced the formation of the mayor's party. 4 mayors are leading this effort, the possibility of others joining. So this is an interesting new dynamic. And what was really interesting is that Mayor Klitschko was a big part of the initial discussions. However, Mayor Klitschko has decided to go his own way. He decided not to run with European Solidarność.
We can try to let's see if we can bring you in, and hopefully all the technical issues have been worked out.
Okay, I'll be very quick because we want to hear from the audience. Really, I just wanted to go through some IRI polling numbers and the polling data that Orysia alluded to, which I think is important. First of all, we all know that Zelensky and his party were successful in parliamentary and presidential elections because they rode in on a wave of discontent with the executive and legislative branches in Ukraine. That's not the case for local elections. These elections are going to be different. The IRI data that we have from January and February, which was a poll of the 24 largest cities, show that people by and large think that their city is going in the right direction. A majority of cities like their mayor and approve of the job that their city council is doing. So Sluha Naroda, in order to compete effectively in these elections, are going to have to do more than rely on popular discontent, because that same discontent doesn't exist at the local level, according to our polling data. 2 other quick things. I want to go back to Ambassador Yelchenko's comments about the irreversibility of the path to Europe. In that same poll, when asked whether Ukraine should be part of the European Union or Russia's customs union, 22 out of the 24 cities, big majority said part of the EU. The only 2, and you can imagine why, is Mariupol and Severodonetsk chose the customs union. And that goes to the last issue that Orysia alluded to, and that is the efforts of Za Życia in the local elections. Now, these elections are going to be largely about local issues, transport, streets, trash delivery, all the usual local issues. But some of these cities may be supportive of Za Życia, but the numbers, if the topic is Ukraine's orientation, then this appeal to a pro-Russia party is going to have a very diminished effect, I would think. But we think that this election will be primarily about these local issues, and then obviously how mayors and city councils have handled the COVID-19 crisis. That's what the elections are going to be about, but very, very solid support for both EU and NATO membership at the local level. And we'll have more data. We're in the field now with a poll. We'll do a second poll before the October 25th elections. And I'll sign off there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Maybe I can just point back to you just in terms of how, what you're hearing in terms of the Zelensky government response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Or see if you want to weigh into how is that being viewed, because obviously there's both an economic component to this, there's the socioeconomic component to this, and it can have a devastating effect on anybody who's in leadership. Do you have a feeling or sense how people are responding? Do they view it that the government has responded? Clearly, there's there's a when you look across in what's taking place in Russia versus Ukraine, Ukraine actually looks like the Ukrainian government looks like a responsible group, more transparent. But maybe is there something that you're seeing within this that could have an impact? You said this would be a one of the issues that would impact the electoral outcomes.
Well,
Sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
Keep going.
No.
Why don't we go to Steve first, and then we'll
Okay.
come to
Sure. Well,
Steve.
again, we're in the field with a poll now, Jonathan, and we did ask a number of questions about governments dealing on the pandemic issue. So that's going to be a huge issue in the local elections. How did both the national government and the local government deal with this pandemic? And obviously, there were differences between what mayors had wanted to do and what the national government had wanted to do. That's what brought about this mayor's party, was primarily differences on how the pandemic should be addressed. So it's going to be a huge issue, but I can tell you this, the data I'm sure will tell us that whatever party locally can convince the local population that it can more effectively handle the pandemic, that is going to go a long way towards ensuring electoral success. And I'll leave that off.
If we could just turn to you. I mean, Steve started to talk about political parties, political party development, and goes back to these elections, really groundbreaking elections in Ukraine. And I had an opportunity to observe, along with Orest, different capacities in these elections. Can I just bring you into, and again, Steve was trying to sort of build on sort of like the political dynamics and how they're changing, including new mayor's party, but maybe we just could bring you in on your thoughts. And we started off, obviously you look at reforms and have been for quite some time, but maybe just go directly into your perspective and thoughts on sort of what has taken place, because this panel is roughly, it's all about, in some sense, about Zelensky too, about the performance of 1 year in office. But can I turn it over to you?
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for engaging me. So as Jonathan said, I work out of London in Chatham House, where we've set up Ukraine Forum to closely monitor what's happening in Ukraine since Euromaidan. So we are the only European think tank that keeps a close eye on Ukraine's domestic politics. And I think our session is really important that we start with it, because in a way, democracy is a software that countries run on. It has its glitches, it needs a constant upgrade, but this is what we are talking about. And Ukraine's predicament has been for decades this kind of rent-seeking system that was built on the really 4 pillars. And these pillars are, penetration of vested interest in government, shadow payroll of members of parliament, control of media outlets, and reach out into law enforcement if you want. So if we keep these pillars in mind, I think what happens in Ukraine is that political sphere remains very vulnerable in Ukraine. And here we were mentioning Russia, and we just also published a study on resilience in Ukraine, where I am one of the co-authors, and we identify Ukraine's political sphere as one of the vulnerabilities that Russia also uses to wage its war against Ukraine. So if you want, Ukraine's democracy is just not the matter of representation and participatory politics, it's a matter of national security. And that's why I think attention to Ukraine's democracy is so key. And Stephen started talking about political parties. I mean, and I'll try to speak briefly. Something's good that happened last year. It's a new electoral code. The new local elections will take based on the party lists, and there will be also preferential voting where Ukrainians could choose a particular name on the party list. This is something that Ukrainian civil society and including Western partners advocated for a long time. So this is good sign, but still the problem remains, like in the United States, it's big money in politics. And this is what wrecks democracy and erodes democracy from inside. And in Ukraine, it's particularly a problem because, the country is so poor because it's so rich. Ukraine has huge shadow economy, and where do those money go? They go into politics. So the new electoral code only partially limits the influence of money in For example, there is no campaign caps in the new electoral code. Or, for example, you cannot self-nominate even at the local level to run for the council, which means that the pluralistic and participatory politics becomes difficult, and people become dependent on some of these, in a way, captured political parties. But since we are talking about democracy, I think if you look at Zelensky's assets when people were analyzing when he just came to power, including us, we were saying this mono-majority is so important. But what happened, that 70% of voting was lacking enough votes, and Sluha Naroda had to make alliances with other parties, which means that Zelensky doesn't have majority anymore in the parliament to pass, including such important things as constitutional changes to complete decentralization. And decentralization remains incomplete. And here I would say, okay, the natural ally for Zelensky would be Poroshenko, because I think the reform agenda would be similar in many ways. But you see now the clash and confrontation with these prosecutions against the ex-president, which necessarily makes this clash even bigger. But I hope we'll get Stephen Beck has a great municipal public opinion poll. And what we see in those polls is that the former Party of Regions, the opposition Platform for Life, is catching up with the Sluha Naroda in the east, and in some cities like in Kharkiv, they are #1. So they will face a severe competition at the local elections, and being so inexperienced and novices also in local politics, it's not given that Zelensky will have a good result in local elections, especially because I think it's in the same IRI poll, 50% of Ukrainians now think that Ukraine is going in the wrong direction. It's a mirror change, whereas a year ago, 50% thought Ukraine is going in the right direction. So my score in a way on also civil society and free media, I see a rupture between civil society and Zelensky's administration. It's unfortunate, but there is this distancing with a couple of exceptions actually, where we see civil society working quite closely on transitional justice. So you have human rights groups working with Anton Koronevich, who leads this work. We have some groups engaged with the new Ministry of Reintegration with the Minister Reznikov, and we see some positive dynamics there. We see the civil society such as Transparency International working with Ivaras at Ukroboronoprom. So that is good signs, but beyond that, there's very little institutional engagement and cooperation. And we saw even during COVID, you know, COVID was Zelensky's 2014, what was Poroshenko was the annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression. And what gave Ukraine this transformational boost is that President Poroshenko invited a lot of volunteers in civil society to contribute to reforms because they saw situation on the ground. Right now, we don't see such outreach from Zelensky, for example, on the healthcare reform, where a lot of small and medium businesses, volunteers and NGOs have these local hubs as a COVID response to provide emergency assistance, but they seem to be all disunited, and there's no team of teams, and there's no feeding of information, and I think it will be in a way lost opportunity. On human rights, I think there's a serious problem we see right now, in particular with the impunity that continues in Ukraine, and we have the case of Handzuk that is not investigated, the case of Sheremet that remains non-investigated and actually is being played politically to an unfortunate result. Right now, Serhiy Sternenko's case, as we speak, there is the activist from Odessa that is being prosecuted for actually, murder while he was acting in his self-defense. So I think impunity remains a problem for Ukraine, and Minister Avakov is being justified as a good crisis management. And little reform is actually demanded in the law enforcement from him, rather than his job is to keep the lid on the pot. Ivana mentioned about judiciary, and it's a big issue to discuss. I think it's missing. I think because of the fact that it's missing, it reverberates through US domestic politics. What you mentioned, Jonathan, with the Derkach tapes and manipulation of you know, through both internal and external forces, weak Ukrainian law enforcement is being for sale, and it's unfortunate. And I think the removal of Prosecutor General Ryaboshabka and replacement by Venediktova is a questionable move. You know, the fact is that she herself didn't even pass the qualification exam to serve on the Supreme Court. So people who are not really qualified are taking positions that are key for Ukrainian rule of law. And self-cleaning of the systems through the High Council of Justice, just to give you a number, out of 2,000 judges approximately, only 15 were dismissed. So this gives you an idea of the kind of judiciary Ukraine still keeps. NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, remains this island of hope. High Anti-Corruption Court hasn't proven itself yet, but unfortunately, this selective prosecution of Poroshenko with this kind of with very unreformed judiciary, I think is a big mistake that president's team is making, and it could backfire to a substantial degree in Ukraine. So all in all, I would say, you know, Ukraine has, in the Zelensky team, is peppered with some good, you know, people and some professionals. But overall, the inner circle of administration comes with the people with a political marketing approach, if you want. They're trying to get low-hanging fruit. They're trying to do the speed. It's a small inner circle, which is in confrontation with the large parts of Ukrainian reform-driven society. And it's a mixture of very eclectic, if you want, ideological views. There was an interesting survey of experts about what are Zelensky's values. It was about 100 experts that were surveyed to identify. And if I tell you that it's a mixture of socialism, oligarchy, nepotism, personal leadership, authoritarianism, and somewhere in the middle of East and West, it's hard to have a cohesive policy to bring Ukraine more to democracy. So I think democratic consolidation is really at risk, and it's an area that will require very close assistance and watch of many of us in Ukraine and outside and across Atlantic. Thank you.
Orysia, thank you for that sweeping picture, and lots to comment on. Orest, can I just turn it to you? I know that you wanted to speak to some of the reforms, particularly on human rights, but also you have a expert on electoral reforms, have tracked this and other reforms as well from various vantage points. But can I just turn it over to you just to pick up and for your opening statement?
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. What I'm going to do is what I did last year and possibly the year before, and I'm also going to focus on the human rights situation in the Russian-occupied Ukraine, Crimea, and the so-called pseudo-republics. Then I'll focus on democratic Ukraine, you know, the 85% of Ukraine that's under government control. Although I must say that Orysia covered definitely some of the things I was going to cover there. So let me start with the occupied territories. Let's start out with one piece of good news. The release since we last met a year ago of some 135 Ukrainian political prisoners, hostages, in 3 separate exchanges with Russia, including prominent cases such as Oleg Sentsov and Stanislav Asayev. The bad news, of course, is hundreds still remain, both in the occupied Donbass and in Crimea and in Russia. Most have been treated very harshly, in appalling conditions, tortured, and the like. Starting out with Crimea, according to the State Department, significant human rights issues in Crimea included abductions, torture and abuse of detainees, unlawful detention, including punitive psychiatric incarceration, very reminiscent of the Soviet Union, harsh prison conditions and the transfer of prisoners arguably illegally to Russia, show trials, no independent judiciary, suppression of freedoms of speech, press, association, assembly, religion, etc. And of course, the occupation authorities continue to engage in violence and harassment of Crimean Tatars and pro-Ukrainian activists in response to peaceful opposition of Russian occupation. So Crimean Tatars are particularly hard hit. Many are in prison on these trumped up charges of alleged terrorism. Sometimes they receive extremely severe sentences. And of the more than 100 Crimean political prisoners, the substantial majority are Crimean Tatar. And just last week, for instance, to kind of illustrate that some of this stuff is ongoing, a Crimean Tatar was charged for what? For refusing to give false testimony against a fellow Crimean Tatar political prisoner. Those with Ukrainian views are targeted as well. Again, just last week, several arrested on, very dubious charges of extremism, for, as far as I can tell, for, doing horrible things like social media posts saying that Crimea should be returned to Ukraine. And two others several months ago received 14-year sentences on what appear to be fabricated charges. So not surprisingly, also Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians also face linguistic, educational, and cultural persecution. And just to flag one other human rights issue, in Crimea, and that's the illegal conscription of some 24,000, I believe, Crimeans into the Russian military in violation of the Fourth Geneva Conventions, and some 100 supposedly who refused have been criminally prosecuted. Onto the Donbass. The situation there is very similar in terms of human rights and restrictions on freedoms as in Crimea, but in some respects it's even worse given the war. So the Russia-led forces have engaged in killings of civilians, forced disappearances and abductions, also horrendous torture and ill treatment, including sometimes sexual violence. And of course, severe repression and no freedoms, complete abridgments of freedoms and rule of law. Again, several have received severe, lengthy sentences for things, among other things, pro-Ukrainian tweets. Just a few days ago, minors protesting pay arrears were arrested and tortured by LNR authorities. Also, a week or two ago, to show how absurd it could get, is a Ukrainian woman living in Spain was visiting her home, her apartment in Donetsk, was arrested by DNR authorities simply for removing the DNR flag of her private apartment that the militants had hung up there. So let me use religious liberties as an illustration of a rights violation based on a State Department report issued just last week. And the Donbas authorities continue to persecute religious minorities, which basically means everybody except for the Russian Orthodox Church, through legal restrictions, confiscations, seizures, looting of property, prosecution of clergy, harassment of congregations. And this includes the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Roman and Greek, Ukrainian Greek Catholics, and various Protestant denominations. And Jehovah's Witnesses are especially targeted because they're banned in both of these pseudo-statelets as extremist organizations. Minority religions have to undergo something called state religious expert evaluations and re-register. But, a lot of the religious groups that were recognized under Ukrainian law are unable to re-register because the Russian proxies are using the much more stringent Russian legal requirements rather than the more lenient Ukrainian law. And many religious groups, including Baptists, Pentecostals, and others, refuse to register because they don't recognize the Russian installed authorities. So in some cases, they meet quietly in homes, and I've even heard in the woods, meeting in the underground, very, again, reminiscent of Soviet times. And in Crimea, its religious situation is maybe not as severe as the Donbass, but minority religious believers also face varying degrees of persecution and discrimination. And just a couple weeks ago, on June 4th, a Jehovah's Witness, for instance, was sentenced to 6 years on alleged extremist charges. For what? Basically for praying at home with others. We also see in the Donbass, well, in Crimea too, of course, Russification. Ukrainian culture and language are repressed, putting a lie to Russia's claim that it wants occupied Donbass to be reintegrated into Ukraine. Freedom House, in their recent reports, put it very succinctly, and I quote, "Professing Ukrainian identity is considered dangerous," full stop. And just last week, by the way, the LNR issued formal decision to eliminate Ukrainian language from schools. Essentially, Russia's declared as the only state language. I could say a lot more, but in a nutshell, I think what we see in the Russian occupied territories is an appalling human rights situation and wholesale flouting of freedoms and democratic norms. Just a couple words on what we could do. One could devote an entire conference about that, but I think what's important is to keep up diplomatic and political condemnation pressure. We need to, governments, NGOs, keep speaking out about this, remind people about what's going on, as the, for example, US mission to the OSCE weekly statements to the 57 OSCE Permanent Council do very well and very succinctly. We also need to not just maintain sanctions, assuming the status quo persists, and unfortunately that's likely to happen, but we really need to increase them. And by no means, under no circumstances, diminish them unless something radically changes. And then finally, we need to keep assisting Ukraine, not only militarily, but in strengthening its democracy and rule of law. This too, among other things, makes it more resilient to Russian aggression. Now, a few words on government-controlled Ukraine. We all know human rights situation, freedom situation there. Ukrainians enjoy basic human rights and freedoms, vibrant civil society, government largely respects civil and political rights of all kinds, including national minorities and religious freedoms. Obviously, it's radically better than the occupied territories, although that's an extremely low bar, but it is what Human Rights Watch and others call a mixed picture. And government-controlled Ukraine, or I'll call it democratic Ukraine, is not without human rights and democracy deficits. And some of these are within the context or exacerbated by the war. This, according to the State Department, UN, various international and Ukrainian NGOs, includes torture and other abuse of detainees by law enforcement personnel, and the SBU, which really needs reforms. Also problems that existed before the war, such as harsh prison conditions, arbitrary arrest and detention, and weaknesses in the rule of law with which we're so familiar. Not to mention widespread government corruption, although obviously it's less than the astronomical corruption we saw in the Yanukovych era, as well as some restrictions on freedom of expression in the media. Now, in 2019, Freedom House's authoritative Freedom in the World Index ranked Ukraine as partly free. And the designations are free, partly free, and not free. Now, that score decreased slightly over the previous year because of increased attacks on activists and journalists, a long-standing problem, as we all know, in Ukraine, as well as attacks on vulnerable communities such as the Roma. And then with respect to democracy, Freedom House issued another report last month called Nations in Transit, and Ukraine's democracy score in 2019 improved marginally over 2018. Some progress was made, I think most of it last year, with things like whistleblower protections or lifting of parliamentary immunity, or as Orysia talked about, and I think Steve probably was going to mention, the new electoral code. But I hate to say it, the way things have been looking lately, I'm not sure we will see improvement this year. Things need to change. And the reason is what both Orysia and you and Jonathan and Ivanka touched upon. It's this troubling pattern of questionable and often politically motivated investigations or threats or prosecutions, whether it be former reformist officials like Ryaboshabka, who really, I think, was a good prosecutor general, who had been dismissed in what I believe is the unfortunate March government shakeup, or continuing to go after Artem Sitnik, the head of NABU, anti-corruption agency NABU, or for that matter, you know, the Euromaidan and other activists, or the shaky case, I believe, of alleged killers of the journalist Pavel Sheremet. Not to mention what everybody's talked about, the plethora, I think it's up to 22 charges leveled against Poroshenko, including several just within the last few days. And so this growing trend, if it is a trend, is quite disconcerting. And I really hope that it won't become a movie that many of us who've been following and dealing with Ukraine for a long time saw before in the late Kuchma or the Yanukovych eras. You know, selective prosecution, selective justice ends up, you know, as Orysia said, not serving Ukraine well. It harms its democracy, it tears its society apart, and it harms its national security. And instead, what we see, again, is the impunity, you know, with bad actors, you know, whether they're who are either go free or are protected, like the Euromaidan killers, or corrupt oligarchs or officials. And the recent State Department report on Ukraine, and I just have to quote it because I think it sums it up perfectly, says the government generally failed to take adequate steps to prosecute or punish most officials who committed abuses resulting in the climate of impunity. So clearly there's a lot of work to still do in cleaning up law enforcement entities like the Interior Ministry, Procuracy, and the SBU. You know, Orysia touched upon it, so I'll kind of shorten it and not touch upon the judiciary, although the bottom line is, despite some of the improvements, judges, the judiciary is still not trusted, and that's a big problem. Now, a couple of just concluding thoughts. One is on democratic Ukraine. One is trajectory matters. You know, democratic Ukraine's at least more or less staying the same. There's some progress here, some regress here, and certainly since the Maidan, there's been dramatic improvement. This stands in contrast to some of Ukraine's EU neighbors, notably Hungary and to lesser extent Poland, who sadly have been moving in a wrong direction in recent years. And number two, and I'll conclude with this, is human rights and democracy, as we talked about in Ukraine, is a mixed picture. It's accurately been described as somewhat dysfunctional, but vibrant and pluralistic. Last year's elections, as we all know, were pretty much free and fair. There are real, if very messy, politics. And this stands, of course, in sharp contrast to Russia and Belarus, who are decidedly in the not free, not democratic category. Indeed, for all of Ukraine's, no matter what Ukraine's democracy and human rights and rule of law shortcomings, Putin's war against Ukraine has been remarkably unsuccessful in moving Ukraine away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. So that's, I think, an important point. But we all know Ukraine can do better, and it has in the past. For example, it was in the free category for a few years under Yushchenko. So I'll leave it at that, and I guess we'll do the grading later. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Orest. What Orysia said earlier too is this phenomenon where you start to see the Russian parties, pro-Russian parties in Ukraine, in essence, make a comeback or deepening support in certain parts of the country. Is that something that you're seeing, that you share that? Is that something that could certainly alter the electoral landscape locally and beyond? What?
Certainly, Jonathan, in certain sections of eastern Ukraine, those areas closest to the fighting, again, have more pro-Russian leanings. So yes, we think that Za Życia will be competitive, but I think their areas of competition will be limited to some very specific geographic areas. They will not win seats in the West. They may win some seats in the center, but their base is primarily in the eastern part of the country.
Okay. Orysia, can you jump in on those questions?
Just a few points, and I think I've written an overview where, you know, in crisis countries refer to types, and in a way we saw how Ukraine dealing with COVID was exposing its vulnerabilities that, you know, that could sometimes gloss over. We forget about them. First of all, overall, I think there was one polling that Ukrainians overall approve Zelensky's handling COVID pandemic, but Ukrainian public opinion could be schizophrenic. At the same time, they saw that there was enough masks, there wasn't enough PPE kits, that a lot of companies and civil society had to chip in to protect the doctors. Ukraine had one of the highest number of, you know, infections among the healthcare professionals. So I think the real assessment of how Zelensky and his government handle it will come with how they will continue the healthcare reform, which according to IRI poll actually remains #1 issue at the local level. There's a lot of anxiety about the quality of healthcare, but also how, you know, Ukrainian institutions are ineffective. And we saw how vested interests could capture even the best technologies such as Prozora, when the ex-minister Yemets was trying, you know, to, despite having money on the books, was not spending the money because he wanted to use it as a leverage to appoint somebody to his own liking. So there will be a big challenge for Ukraine, how to cushion the economic decline that will come, right? You know, it will hit the voters right ahead of elections, and that there's not so far, I mean, they're trying to do a cheaper loans for businesses, but it's still way too expensive for people. There was no, you know, programs to support either, like in the West, in some wealthier economies, either to support people remaining on the payroll through difficult periods, or any kind of emergency stabilization fund for continuing paying rent. So Ukrainian economy, I think, will collapse around 10%, which is quite a lot if you look at what Ukraine has already suffered with the Russian aggression. And here, you know, the question comes to also transparency of the use of stabilization fund, because with the cut of the budget because of COVID, a lot of money has been dumped into the stabilization fund, and then part of it was used for pensions. It's not clear what link it has to fighting COVID and paying pensions. And I think this is also an area for both civil society and those who want to make sure they use this crisis to build something more sustainable in the place of existing institutions that are not adaptive, that are not actually possessing correct information, because one of the problems with dealing with pandemic is having on-spot information about death rate, about testing, about spread and trace. And you know, one thing that also exposed Ukraine's vulnerability to hacking and cybersecurity, because you may have noticed the scandal with this app that Ambassador mentioned. A lot of public services are now being transferred to the smartphones, but there was a big leak of data from this platform to discredit the platform itself. You know, who did it, how it was done, it's a matter of investigation. But the low trust society, the way Ukraine is, every time a government even tries to introduce some viable service, it's being basically shut down on the ground to create chaos. And this is something that is really risky for you know, we see what's happening across the world with polarization. But I think it's a real also risk in Ukraine with the upcoming elections, with Russia wanting to have more chaos, and with Zelensky's team not being able to clearly create this basis in the society that would support their action. And strategic communication also is lacking, because a lot of people don't understand their strategy, either around the reintegration of Donbass or around even tackling COVID. It wasn't very coherent.
Orest, did you want to jump in?
The only thing I will say on COVID is just to bring it back to, because I did talk a lot about the occupied territories, and in the Donbass, all the problems it causes in Ukraine, it's only exacerbated there because you have an aged population, you have a horrible healthcare system, and you have very poor governance. So,
yeah, and I think it's important to. I'm glad that you're including this as we look at grading and sort of looking at what's taking place. Orest, thank you for bringing in both. We have about a little over like 6-7 minutes before we have to shift to our next program. What I wanted to do, there was a couple of questions, but I want to get each one of your grades. This is, it's unfair to try to fit the grades in such a short time period, because the list that I have of reforms that I could go through and sort of even checking off my own box is incredibly long. But given that we have a short amount of time, I wanted to maybe just start with Steve and sort of ask for his grade. And of course, this conversation on reforms is taking place in a number of forums, both in spaces like London, Washington, Kiev, and And I think everything, particularly Orysia, what you were talking about this lack of sort of understanding of focus, attention, direction, even with Zelensky still a year into this, is really something that's important to point out, because it's hard for us here in Washington and elsewhere to interpret what direction Ukraine is going when it seems like Zelensky's direction is really not known directly to the Ukrainian public or even within the government. So if I could just start maybe, Orest, with you, with your grade, and then Orysia, and then we'll go with Steve. So Orest, over to you.
I'm just going to focus on democratic Ukraine because obviously if we were talking about the occupied territories and all that, it's objectively speaking, it's an F, but also even if you look at it, comparing it to last year, it's basically stayed the same. You know, the human rights and freedom situation was lousy then. It continues to be lousy now. There have been no real improvements, unless, of course, you want to count the release of political prisoners. For what I call government-controlled, Kiev-controlled democratic Ukraine, I think it's a wash. It's a 3. If the benchmark is last June, it looked to me like in 2019, if this was 4 months ago, okay, before the dismissal, the government shakeup, I would have maybe given it a B-, even a B. But now, especially with these, politically motivated investigations, prosecutions, and other examples of reforms sort of not moving forward, and even some regression in some areas. And maybe I'm being generous here too, but I'll give it a C+.
Orysia?
So last year we had B for the democratic governance.
That's right.
Yeah. B. Well, I think for me, because I do believe that out of all these 4 areas that we broadly discussed, elections, political parties, free media, civil society, respect for human rights, and independent judiciary is so paramount. And I think the way we saw a certain backtracking on it, because we saw Constitutional Court canceling these changes to the judicial reform on the 11th of March that Zelensky proposed, and he didn't push through them. We saw the sacking of quite reformist prosecutor general. We saw how the judiciary is kind of protracting its own life and procreating itself. So I think because of that, and because there's a certain clash now and rupture, between civil society and government. There's always tension between the two. That's the function of civil society, to keep the checks and balances. But because there's a certain exclusion of civil society from reform progress, and there's not enough platforms for people to contribute, I would put it B-. So I think there's a certain backtracking on democracy.
Steve?
Great. Okay, first on the political party front, on the positive side, looking especially at recent developments and looking towards the local elections, we don't see any one party running the table in local elections. We think these will be very competitive, multi-party elections, which will result in a number of city councils being controlled by various political parties. And so that's a real plus for Ukraine. That's one of the hallmarks of a true democracy, is a multi-party, truly competitive electoral system. I'm going to then go to Sluha the road, the political party. Hopefully, the president will invest time and energy into truly building a national party with national reach. And so I'm going to, because of that's still not certainty, we hope that happens, I'm not going to give Ukraine a higher grade than I did last year. So I'm sticking with the B mark that we gave last year.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you for all of your sort of input, all 3 of the speakers too, for grades, also presentations. Just moderator's prerogative, I wanted to add my own grade to this. And I think I'm going to be a little harsher, because I think it does a disservice to, for partners of Ukraine, given what we see in terms of political prosecution, what seems to be a lack of general motivation to actually implement reforms, that I think we do, partners of Ukraine do Ukraine a disservice by not being clear about how do you achieve the objectives of Euro-Atlantic integration. Right now, what we see in terms of the political prosecutions, bringing in those people that may not be as willing to carry out reforms or to lead anti-corruption bureaus in the way that they should, whether it's the prosecutor general's office, or when we're looking at attacks on Nabu. I think there's some serious concerns and doubts, and I think by giving them a grade similar to last year, it suggests that we're closer to where we were when we were all optimistic, I think a year ago, about this new government and commitment to move forward on key reforms. And I'm not convinced, even though I know there was a passage of banking reform and land market reform, we've seen in the past where governments have passed these laws without implementing them. And then the international community using conditionality as a way to move Ukraine in the right direction. It shouldn't be that the government has to be pushed by conditionality of the IMF or others to move the country in the right direction. Orest said that we should be worried about a replay of what we've seen by previous governments. And I think we shouldn't be looking back 10 years, we're 6 years post-Maidan, but 10 years saying there was another revolution that took place and Ukraine didn't achieve its objectives. So my score is a C, because I think that and it could go lower than that, but I think I'm realistic, and I think that may not be harsh a grade enough for this situation, not because there hasn't been movement in the right direction in some areas. It's all at risk. And I think the moment of the coronavirus pandemic is so deeply challenging for any government that you could see serious backsliding. I'd rather see US officials and others that are friends of Ukraine, including civil society, speak very firmly right now about not losing this moment. So I'm going to end, I'll end with a C. And Walter, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us and for sticking with us. We apologize for some of the technical glitches. All the voices that we had today are incredibly deeply engaged on these issues and bring such great expertise. And we look forward to another opportunity and a conversation on these same issues soon. So Walter, back to you.
I just simply wanted to say how grateful I am to the four of you, the four graders of this first panel, because they were remarkably rich presentations. These are presentations that we've come to expect at the highest levels. You really, you are four aces, and I don't know how to thank you for all that. Thank you very much again, for all four of you.
Thank you.
Again.
Thank you.
The next year.
Thank you very much, Walter.
Right.
Thank you.